So the next session is a panel discussion of the white paper and the themes of the center. One of the main goals of the workshop today and tomorrow is to try and get everybody involved that is interested in the area of digital agriculture. So far, what we've done is develop a draft white paper. We've had input from a handful of faculty, both in engineering and in the College of Agriculture. But really, there's so many of you doing research in this area that we want to try and make sure we have input from many more people on the major themes, on the broad directions of the center, and on the white paper itself. So the white paper is structured around 4 broad themes, and we have 5 people who are going to help lead the discussion of the current contents of the white paper, but we'd really like to get your input on what you see as being important in terms of how these themes, what kind of role these themes will play in the context of digital agriculture, and also what might be missing today in terms of technology areas that could help make your research better. And so that's 2 of the main topics that we're going to start discussing, and then we'll open it up for questions. Okay? So let me quickly introduce our 5 panelists. Kaiyu Guan is an assistant professor in agricultural and biological engineering. He, in addition to being a crop science expert, has also been using sensors and IoT pretty heavily, including some NSF-funded projects on the use of these technologies in his research. Lyudmila Mainzer is a technical program manager at NCSA. She leads some of their data science-related projects, including projects with industry, with several company partners on applying data science techniques to their data. Andrew Leakey is a professor in plant biology with a joint appointment, I think, in crop sciences, if I remember right. And Andrew has been doing very interesting research on exploring drought-resistant varieties of sorghum. That's really looking at genotype and phenotype connections, and is probably one of the most, I think, interesting users of sensors on this campus, and one of our first guinea pigs, I think, in terms of the IoT infrastructure that we want to develop in this center. Adam Davis is a professor and head of crop sciences, and so he brings a very broad perspective on the roles that technology can play in a variety of different domains in crop sciences and in agriculture in general. And finally, Matt Hudson, who you've already all heard from this morning. Matt is a professor also in crop sciences, and he's an expert in genomics and genetics and their use in plant breeding. So I'm going to pose a couple of questions to them one by one and ask each one of them to address those questions. And I'll ask you to stick to about 1 minute or so each so we can keep the conversation moving, and also so we can open it up for questions from the audience as soon as possible. But just to introduce the topic, again, like I said, we have these 4 themes in the center. And you each know what theme you're representing here. Can you first say a few words about, in the context of digital agriculture, what role does that theme play, and vice versa? How does digital agriculture enter into the research, the application of work in that theme? So automation, data, crops and animals, and people in agriculture. So Kai, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Victor, and very honored to be here. I have a quick correction. My home department affiliation is Natural Resource Environmental Science. I'm very proud to be in that department. But I'm in the Ag College, and also this building is also my home because I'm a Blue Waters professor here. So I'm in charge of talking about automation, and to me, automation is really to enable So I see its goal is really to enable the stakeholders in the agriculture domain to do even better work. And so I will borrow the concept from the NSF, cyber physical system type of concept, when we talk about the automation. I think the automation really when we talk about in the digital ag domain, we really need to think about how we enable such that we can close the loop. So close the loop is really, really important. I envision 3 big bubbles that they mostly sequential but also iterative. So first part is you define your problem and you start to collect the information or the data. So that's the part. And then the second bubble that I envision is once you have the data, you need to analyze, you need to model that, you need to come up with some results understanding. And so that's the second bubble that I see. And then the last bubble that I see is once you have these model analytics, your ultimate goal is for a decision-making thing. And so these 3 things, if you can connect these in the context of digital ag, I think it's really closed the loop. Now, I said there are multiple stakeholders in this domain. Farmers, obviously. Farmers care about how to better manage their fields, how to better use irrigation water, how to better do nitrogen, how to get rid of weed. And then there's also researchers that doing, for example, phenotyping. And there are also supply chain, industry, as well as I want to emphasize policymakers. What's the use of the digital ag when I say close the loop? I think policymakers need that too, because they want to know, for example, crop insurance. How are they gonna design the better crop insurance? That's their decision making. For a lot of government agencies, they also want to know how they can make the agricultural environment to be sustainable, so that our land not grow a lot of food. At this moment, it can be sustainable down the road in 100 years or 200 years. So with that, I think I will stop there. I think it's a really broad thing when we think about digital ag in terms of the automation.
Ludmila, can you talk about data and how it enters into the picture?
Yes, thank you very much. Data. When you look at the white paper, the theme is introduced through the concept of precision agriculture. That really is the center of what we're trying to do. And I find that key to understanding the role of data in this project, because in order to precisely predict and decide what to do and invest money appropriately, one must be fully informed. And that means being in possession of a lot of data from many different facets of this scientific area. So the data in agriculture are very multi-level, multifaceted, and highly diverse. They come from a variety of levels of complexity, from genetic level of a single plant to a survey of a field and the interrelation among plants, animals in the same field as an ecological system, to data that come from farmers and service providers in terms of prices and availability of products, as well as data on weather, satellite imaging, and you can see how diverse these data are in their types, in their amounts, and in their complexity, which obviously poses both advantages and problems. Well, number one, it means big data, which are difficult to store, access, analyze, and secure. All of these are opportunities for us to resolve. And number two, because of the data heterogeneity and the need to integrate across them, we are facing a difficult statistical problem. How do we take advantage of all the different data sets that are potentially collected by a variety of different people, different researchers, different farmers, and yet avoid batch effects and loss of statistical power and so forth? The white paper also mentions blockchain to a great extent. I'm unfortunately not familiar with that technology, so I can't comment. But I think what I've said already is difficulties enough. Next.
Thank you. So the next theme is crops and animals, and we've integrated them into one theme, but we have two people on the panel that I hope will be able to represent both of them. So Andrew, can you go next?
Sure. So I view myself as representing a broad group of people working on plants and animals as users for tools coming from computational science and engineering. I think I'd like to emphasize that the sort of two major categories of application here. One is production agriculture, and so we heard a bit about that from the last talk and what AirScout does. And that covers an incredibly broad range of applications from the farm field all the way through the production chain to the food on the table, the gas in the tank of the car, the factory that's using a raw material. That's one category. And then the second category I would describe more broadly as agricultural research. And so this is the very substantial effort to actually improve the crops and the animals that we're using to produce all of these things. And there's a very wide range of applications for almost every element of computer science and engineering that you can imagine in various aspects of those. They work at different scales. So production agriculture is going to be much larger. The temporal frequency is probably going to be lower. Whereas on the ag research side, the spatial scales will be smaller, but we might be talking about thousands to tens of thousands of small plots within a single field that we want to be able to capture as intensively as possible. And so the sorts of challenges we face there include sensor development, sensor networks, data integration, communication networks, cyber infrastructure for databasing and modeling, robotics, automation, computer vision. You can layer any and all of those things in as a step in that process. And I would say there's a very large and enthusiastic community at the south end of campus who are itching to get hold of those tools. So if you represent the north end of campus, you have a large user base that are excited to go out and test these things.
We are the North Pole.
Thanks. And Adam, if you can address the same category.
Yeah, so I think that there are two really large types of activities, again, that Andrew introduced. But I would say that on the one hand, we've got optimization of pre-existing systems, and that's going to be through more precise application of inputs, better mitigation of weather risk, helping supply chains be more efficient. However, I would say that there's an entire area that we haven't talked about today, and that's really not talked about much in agricultural research, which is exploration of the adaptive landscape for other cropping systems. And in general, one of the trends of the last 100 years in agriculture has been the displacement of labor through energy inputs. And in doing so, we've gotten ourselves locked into a system where we're farming ever larger areas with smaller and smaller margins. And when we've got those smaller margins, we're much more susceptible to weather and other types of risk, and those risks are increasing. Now, if we can use advances from the Center for Digital Agriculture to enable transformative changes in our cropping systems as well, through robotics, through management or data-intensive management of our systems, we can open up new vistas for what types of crops and animal ecosystems that we create. So I'll give you an example from my own area of work. My area of specialization is in weed management. And we're right at the edge of a crisis in weed management where we've burned through most of our herbicide modes of action because our systems are oversimplified because we don't have enough labor on the landscape in the Midwest to manage these systems for ecosystem services first. Through AI, through robotics, we can begin to create much more diverse systems that create weed management benefits inherent to the system. This is something that will be transformative for agriculture, something that we can do through the Center for Digital Agriculture, and could be affordable for the farmer and actually allow the farmer to recover more of the farm gate dollar. Right now, farmers are subject to something called the cost price squeeze, where more and more of the farm gate dollar has gone to the input and to the processing sectors. We can use advances in digital agriculture to recover value through the farmer, for the farmer from the farm gate dollar.
Thank you. So the fourth area, which is people in agriculture, I think is a little unusual in the sense that from what I've seen of the other centers in this area, it's not a component that they have tended to include, but yet it's super important because it deals with the downstream impacts of agriculture and food-based systems. Kathy Bayless, who was on the group that actually helped us write that part of the component, is out of town, but then at the last minute, her backup, who was supposed to be on the panel, Zainab, also could not be here, and so Matt has bravely agreed to represent the broad area, but he was very much involved in the discussions and the writing of that section. So I'm sure Matt will be able to represent them well. So it's people in agriculture.
So if I appear to be uncomfortable, it is because I am pretending to be a people person, and it doesn't come naturally. So the people sector is, as Vikram said, I think a little neglected in this area, but I think actually Chris gave a really good explanation of why this is absolutely critical. So without a thorough understanding of the economics, the sociology, the rural dynamics in populations and labor and things like that, none of this stuff really makes a lot of sense. And we can do all the research we like on genomics or crop improvement or monitoring animals or making robots. If people don't want to use that, it's not going to do anyone any good. So the people section of the Center for Digital Ag is really aimed at making sure that whatever happens in the other areas is grounded in some kind of economic and social reality, that we're doing things that actually benefit people at the end of the day. And this is a highly interdisciplinary area, so it encompasses anything from social sciences, social services, human and community development, food and human nutrition, agricultural economics, all the way through to things like social media and managing of social media data flows and using social media information and web-based information to do things like track disease outbreaks. So there are many different facets of this, and none of them are my specialized area. But I'm going to try and represent why this theme is a key part of the center and make sure that it continues to be included in our discussions.
Thanks. So that was just a very, very quick background sort of overview of the four themes and what their relationship is to digital agriculture. The second question, which I will pose, I am also going to pose to the audience. So hopefully you have some thoughts to contribute also on this. And the question is, what technology capabilities do we lack today that would either benefit your theme area, so for the people in crops and animals, the people working on people in agriculture, how can improved technology help make your area more effective, more productive, more sustainable, and so on? And for the people representing the technology areas, automation and data, what kinds of technology advances do you think we might be able to develop that would help contribute to the other areas? And it's really, the point here is that the interaction between these four areas is where most of the really interesting developments are going to be. And I'll ask the panelists to address that very quickly, and then I'd like to hear the audience's input on that also, because this is really one of the critical ways in which we think the center can help everybody here in the room and on campus interested in this problem. So what technology capabilities do we lack or can we develop? So, Caillou, do you want to go first?
So I think I like Chris' talk, and Chris already gave a very nice slide to summarize what are the existing very exciting technology there. From my own perspective, we should continue developing technology, but get back to what I just said. I think close the loop is important. If you design a technology, you need to really connect to the stakeholders' need, and that connection require more thoughts and practice experience. Another aspect I really think about is technology is one aspect. When you think about human being, you think about stakeholders, economy, economic factors. Whether you can build a very fancy technology that for research purpose maybe it's very useful, but then if you want to really make it useful for farmers, you have to consider the economic part. And so that actually puts the digital ag in a very even challenging level, because it's not only you have a solution, you build $1 billion solution, but it won't be used because farmer won't be able to pay that, or your stakeholders won't be able to pay that. Now you build a slightly, you may have a lower ended solution with cheaper, but then they still address the majority of the need, and they could be very, very cheap, and that could be a possibility to be used. I just want to make that point.
Thank you. Ludmila?
Yes, my theme was supposed to be data, and you may recall I mentioned how those data are of a very large size. And there's a thing called bringing compute to the data. And what does that mean? Normally, if we have very large data sets stored in a point A, in a vault somewhere, I don't know, on disks or whatever, and they require very sophisticated analysis on a supercomputer or a data analytics platform. And those computers are located in point B. Well, that means that those data have to go from point A to point B and land on those disks, and then those computers can chew through the data and produce some result, which maybe has to go to point C. All of this moves data. And that is fraught with multitude of problems. It's time-consuming, it's laborious, data get lost, data get attacked. It's just not nice, especially when we routinely have to work on petabytes of data, which is indeed the case. So an idea has occurred. Why don't we move compute to the data? And I have not yet seen a thing that would qualify yet. If you do a quick Google search, the solutions that come up are, well, we've intelligently reduced the size of our data set, and then we moved it to point B. That still moves data. Or another solution is, well, we've come up with this very secure platform that allows you to sit in point B and access the data without actually knowing, this is mostly from human genomics, about knowing the exact individuals that you're computing on. But you're still ending up transporting some data back to point B in order to look at them. You just don't know which ones you're transporting. You could still use this technology for ag if you're working on some highly patentable data. You're still moving data. Moving compute to the data could be something like, can we come up with computational technology that is so cheap that you can quickly buy it, assemble it, do your compute, get rid of it? Can we do that? That does not only pertain to hardware, it has to pertain to software. Because right now, in order to do analyses we want effectively, it takes a very long time to churn through data because our algorithms are suboptimal. So we have to do a lot of work in order to improve how we work with data computationally in software, and then put them on technology that is so cheap and easy to procure, it is basically disposable. All the while working on somehow compressing and condensing those data so that maybe we don't have to store every single byte of it. so that the data becomes smaller, compute becomes cheaper, then maybe we can solve the problem.
So I can't resist, but I think that is a problem very dear to my heart because we work on basically trying to do computing near the sensors, edge computing, which is essentially doing processing of the data very close to where it's generated and greatly reducing the volume of data that needs to be sent back for offline processing later. So I think it's a very important point. Andrew?
So from the plant and animal point of view, I see us having two really big bottlenecks. One we generally refer to as phenotyping, and so this is just measuring the characteristics of the plant or animal that we're interested in. This could be their rate of growth, this could be their chemical composition, this could be almost any aspect of the organism that's going to be in play. We still depend to a massive degree on humans to go out and measure things. Often by taking destructive samples, but particularly in the last 5 years, there's a growing number of examples where we can much more rapidly capture that information from thermal data, hyperspectral data, even just RGB photographs taken potentially autonomously in the field. And so anything that we can do in terms of improved sensor development is valuable. Anything we can do in terms of automation and robotics is extremely valuable. And anything we can do to cut down on the amount of actual chemical or molecular analyses that need to be done in the lab after samples have been collected is huge. It's an incredibly rare thing to go and hear a plant scientist give a presentation where they've, analyzed all of the data that they collected last season before the next growing season started, right? Our standard mode of operation is so often, oh yeah, back in 2015, we discovered that such and such. So our learning cycle is very slow, and the more I interact with people in physics and engineering, the more horrified I realize they are by that. And so anything we can do to accelerate that process would be extremely valuable. And then tied to that, is just the ability to, a lot of the same sorts of themes that were just discussed, to actually integrate these data sets, make them interoperable, put them in a database. As a community, we spend far, far too much time attempting to collate and organize our data, and not enough time actually investigating what it means and what it's telling us. And I think there are very clear opportunities to improve that on the computing side.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Adam?
I'll talk about the production and post-harvest end of things. So the technologies that I see as being most important are ones that allow us to manage farms as ecosystems and agricultural landscapes as ecosystems. And that's going to require targeted management according to variation in the production environment, and not just at the subfield scale, but from the patch to regional scale. So in order to do this in a way, we have monocultures because they're easy for one person to manage in a monotonic way across large areas. With robotics and AI, we can begin to think at a patch scale without having to add huge amounts of extra human labor to that equation. And that enables us to think about designing agroecosystems where ecosystem services are front and center. And so, we can make systems that are much more nitrogen efficient, water efficient, less reliant upon herbicides for weed control. We can change the equation of what our agroecosystems can do. On the post-harvest side, I think that we need to find ways of maintaining the source identity of our grains and our other products much more efficiently and securely. And so these are areas where sensors and blockchain and other technologies can really become important in maintaining that source to end user identity of each of these products.
Mm-hmm. Matt?
Okay, so Luda mentioned bringing the compute to the data. The interesting thing about people is over the last couple of decades, people have started carrying surprisingly powerful von Neumann architecture computing devices around with them, or even physically attached to them in many cases. And the interesting part there is the compute is already at the data. There's a lot of compute at the data. Even in third world agricultural economies, increasingly cell phones and smartphones are ubiquitous because they reduce the cost of doing business. They increase your economic potential and your ability to sell your stuff at the best price, acquire your inputs at the best price. So in many cases, people don't purchase them specifically for that. They buy them to play Candy Crush or answer email when they're supposed to be in a workshop. But the actual physical reality is that if we had efficient data processing and informed consumers who allow their selected data to be passed into open architecture that can be used for research, I think this is a key aspect of many different types of research across the people spectrum at many different levels. And it's something where there's already a lot of activity, but most of the activity is revolved around specific platforms, specific companies, specific fields, specific marketing concepts. It's not something where we've actually tried to come up with an open architecture that supports all of these different things. So open architectures for personal data and personal social media and personal economics, I think, are something that's going to grow a lot and that we need to be part of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. So I'm going to pose the same question to all of you in the audience. What technology improvements would you like to see that might benefit your area of work? Anything that would make your lives better in any way? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? David?
You need one of those sensors that you can put out in front of the tractor that can stick something in the ground and know how much nitrogen is in the ground, and then do all the calculations so by the time the end of the tractor puts nitrogen down, it knows what's to do.
So nitrogen sensors that feed a nitrogen
I'm teasing, of course, but
fertilizer.
I think that if we could get the really bright people in the north part of campus to think more about nitrogen sensors, it could do a lot of people a lot of good.
So we should talk, but we're actually working on a proposal that essentially is talking about how to do better nitrogen sensing at lower cost. And I'm trying to we have a group of people interested in exactly that. So I think this is the kind of project that I think we can try and really catalyze and bring together if we have the right people from ACES.
Great.
Anyone else? We have a question back there, and then Jackie.
You're right there, but we were discussing in the hallway the need for biological sensors, and particularly biological sensors to detect specific pests, specific insects, disease organisms. Tremendous need for that, and then a tremendous need for, as you've discussed, taking that and turning it into a decision point for the producer and informing the decisions they're making.
So I think you're saying new kinds of sensors, or is it new kinds of sensors, or is it lower cost, lower energy, those kinds of things?
Well, often new kinds of sensors that can. So I'll just be selfish and talk about insects because I'm in insect pest management. But the ability to assess and monitor insect populations out in the field and the number of insects that are out in the field and the severity of that, from an agronomic management standpoint, would be tremendously beneficial. And right now that information is expensive, and it's not expensive in the point of adding to production cost. It's expensive to the point that people aren't doing it, and they're just making decisions without that information.
Yep, makes sense. And by the way, you don't have to apologize for being selfish. The whole point of the question is, from your point of view, what would you like to have? So it really is about your interests and your goals. I think Jaggi had a question here.
Yeah, so a comment about, are we looking at a system of systems approach? Because if you looked at all of this, there's a very disparate systems. Each has its own input, output, and requirements. If we looked at farm management from a system of systems approach, it might, I mean, the models might be might give us a lot more fidelity to look at where is it that you want to make changes to make the improvements that we are all talking about. I mean, it's just an idea that, I mean, I'm not the system of systems expert, but I'm doing some little work in it for different applications. But I see a lot of value in trying to add that to some kind of an analysis as a part of the center.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think system of systems is a complex area. Kai, you don't have a comment?
I fully concur with that idea, and I really appreciate that idea. And I think one of the risks that we get into think about production agriculture is that, suddenly people think we just put all the sensors in the field, and have drones, have so nitrogen, soil moisture sensor, small weather station there. I think it's good as an intensive study site, but then if you have a sort of system, I think more practical sort is you have some of these research sites that can be heavily instrumented, and then you have some process-based model or analytical tools to understand, and such that you can identify the weakness in the system, such that you can start to pull things out while still keep a good understanding about the system. I think from that angle, especially from the research perspective, that will be very beneficial. That's actually how I foresee when you think about agricultural ecosystem. It's a system.
Exactly. A comment back there? Go ahead, Love, and then we have
Right.
answer.
A lot of my research thinks about food and flavor, and so it's further down from agriculture. But it's often kind of difficult for me to think through how would someone in agriculture think about flavor? Like what is the downstream effects of different interventions, of different methods, things like that.
Mm-hmm. So is there a technology advance that you think might help with that?
I'm not sure how to approach this actually. Whether it's just a pure scientific question of almost like a phenome to phenome association or an intervention to phenome association, or I'm not sure even how to cast the problem. But I think there is a central question, and I think what Adam was mentioning about kind of very specific tracking of individual fields and individual crops would help with this in some sense, but I think there might be other aspects to it.
Well, I think part of what you're getting at is that we also need to pay attention to quality of our harvest, and we pay most attention to yield in agronomy, but there are so many constituents of yield, and we could be, so in the wine industry, they look at that problem very explicitly and quantitatively. Same in the olive oil industry. We could do that with our products as well.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to add also, I think that, first of all, the idea of flavor in food and acceptability in food and those kinds of concepts are definitely not outside of the scope of this center. I mean, you said they're further on from agriculture, but not the way we've defined digital agriculture in this center. And I think that the people theme incorporates a lot of those concepts. And again, it's a key fact of production and economics and the value chain that, if you've got to grow things people want to eat, right? And so finding that data on which things are in demand, which things people prefer, and tying data from people's own personal preferences, for example, from mobile apps, via things like blockchain technologies back to individual fields and individual perceptions. That's the kind of thing, as Adam said, the wine industry takes seriously, but it's not something many other industries currently do. But there's various, especially in the horticultural area, there's various additional areas where that could be used to add value.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think that's very much within the spirit of what we're talking about. And if there were quick methods to assess, flavor as one of the phenotypes that we look at in these sorts of trials. When I said quality, that was kind of one of the things I would get at. I think there are lots of people who would be very interested in that.
Mm-hmm. There are people
on the
Chris,
post,
and then back there.
On the post-harvest side, that was interesting comments from Adam about kind of a patchwork concept. And one of the things that I think is a big loss for agriculture has been this commoditization of the crops. That my corn is the same as the farmer down the street's corn. That there's an opportunity here for the grower to also capture the value of the data tied to their, that price is out of their control in a sense. Their input costs are out of their control, and the price of what they can sell the crop for is out of their control, unless they regain control of the data, that's associated with it. And if they have that production information, that's a huge value. If that's the ability of the grower to protect it through blockchain, through that process, some way that they can capture that value, and that value is not removed from them and commoditized in a sense, because that disincentivizes the grower from really caring about making an improvement. So I think that's an important actuating technology if we can help that grower hold on to something of value.
Can I mention something just related to that? If we're talking about how you make your corn worth more than the guy down the street's corn, putting value on the sustainability by which things have been produced is potentially important. So I'm interested in water use efficiency. If you just look at corn grown here under relatively high humidities versus corn grown somewhere further west, and you can keep track of this sort of information, you can potentially argue that, per drop of water, this was produced in a higher value way. I think there are all sorts of equivalents to that we could consider that could be part of that equation.
I think that having the farmers have control of their data is very difficult if you can get that same data and model it from space in satellites, and it's freely available to anybody at any time. Then having ownership over your data, I think, for farmers is an incredible challenge. And the other just comment that I want to make in listening to this is we are surrounded by crops that we don't want to eat. So we've made an entire ecosystem. We have 5 England's worth of land that we associate with crops we don't want to eat in this country. And so I think we need to also think about that. We don't just grow crops for food for us. We grow it for the products that we make from it. And that's mostly what we do here today.
Right, I'd like to piggyback on that. So, some of the work that Girish is doing on his robotics with these soft harvesting arms, for example, can enable a precision harvesting of a polyculture that could be producing things we want to eat, but at a price point that you could not pay human harvesters to do. Mm-hmm. And so I would encourage us to not only consider relentless optimization of the current system, but think about other potential systems out there that are possible, and what might be the ideal system, food and production system that we want to move towards, and how can technology enable that, both from a consumption point of view, an environmental point of view, a rural livelihood point of view. Let's imagine what we want, not just get stuck within the current system.
Yeah, I agree.
In fact, I've been listening to a podcast called the Urban Farming Podcast by Farmer Greg, which is all about exactly this. It's looking at agriculture or really small scale agriculture for consumption at much higher value.
I just wanted to say something as well about Lisa's comment that the classic production ag answer to that is that no, but people want to eat the cows and pigs that eat those crops, right? Even if we don't want to eat them. I think that's changing, right? And if you see the way that the fashions in food and the startups and things like this, things like the Impossible Burger, are where the value added is now, not in bulk production of beef and pork. So that economy is probably going to have to change, and we should be thinking about how it could change in a more sustainable and more profitable for rural communities kind of way.
Mm-hmm. So I think you've been waiting patiently for a while.
Yeah, I'll change the topic to livestock because the area we work in is livestock production. But mm-hmm. I think the same is basically true for dairy and poultry, but I'll talk specifically about pigs, both professionally and personally interested there. But if you look at our industry over the last 25 years, we doubled productivity in terms of kilograms produced per breeding female per year, and we've halved our profit margins. And that's what you'd expect, right? Because the first 15 years of that, the big ate the small, the efficient ate the inefficient, and now we're all just suffering from overproduction. And so I look at it and say, what technologies can we bring to the table to help control supply management? And I don't mean that in an anti-competitive way, but I mean that in a integrated way all the way through to food processors, right? We have routine conversations today with McDonald's, right? That's not a big deal for us to walk into McDonald's and talk to Bruce Feynman about their supply chain and what are we going to do? And so how do we tie that together better to actually put more value back at the farm gate on the production side? Because it is a value proposition challenge that we're just running a race to the bottom. And, you know, we row crop, family row crops as well. And right, it's the same game. We're just race to the bottom on all this. And so how do we not improve efficiency, but how do we use blockchain or whatever those other technologies are to drive value through? And I think that to me is the big opportunity on the livestock side. And so how do we, I think it's a data problem. It's a machine learning problem to predict our production systems are obviously highly variable. And how do we use data to drive that? We're still very much stick your thumb in the air and hope.
And are those technologies something that you think farmers or livestock producers would be able to use, or are these broader systems that would have broader applicability somehow?
I think they have to start at the producer level, but remember the average pork production company in the U.S. today is $1 billion plus organization. So right. They're not farmers anymore. Let's just right. They're large manufacturing operations, and so the capital wherewithal is there to do it on the production side, but the value is actually created at the interchange between packer, processor, and retail. Yeah. Right. The meat business continues to be the motto of the meat business is sell it or smell it. And so, right, it's a truly perishable commodity. And so as we overproduce, there's a very limited lifespan on that in the supply chain. And so it has to get discounted to go into retail. And so how do we help manage that 14-month supply chain to the level of retail? Because the retail price hasn't changed over the last 20 years. We just get a smaller and smaller percentage of that.
So I'm not sure if this is appropriate, but I mean, the same kind of things we've been saying before about crops, I think might apply here, right? So if you're rearing something like grass-reared belted Galloways, I'm sure there's plenty of demand for your product, but there's a lot of logistical issues there, and it's these large-scale meat processors that are engaged in this race to the bottom economics that's was reminiscent of Detroit automobile makers in the 80s and 90s, right? And it doesn't go anywhere good.
The challenge with the niche, so the grass-fed blah, 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 or the whatever, is that on a low percentage of the carcass, you can sell value added. But the cost of production for the entire creature is so great on all the scrap, and it's not really scrap, but right, it's the front shoulder and trim and everything else. That all gets sold as commodity product, and there's really no way to make money on that. Right, so it's a little bit like trying to raise non-GMO soybeans.
That's how it works now, right? But if you think about it, they're selling Impossible burgers made of genetically engineered hemoglobin and tofu for $11, right? So, I mean, there must be a market for sustainably reared hamburger and other meat byproducts, and there's just not being thoroughly exploited because the logistics aren't there.
Maybe.
That's a pretty good result. There's a question from behind you.
Behind you, yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to pick up on the data, moving compute to data, and also the systems idea. I'd like to get a sense of whether there is a real-time kind of nature in the computational requirements here. It seems to me that the timescales that we're thinking about in terms of how quickly you want the result from the compute are relatively long, and so that sort of affects what kind of compute you may want to do closer to the data.
I think there is a real range. I can't name names, but having worked with the compute very much follows the cycles of harvest and planting. And just as was mentioned earlier today, there is a few weeks window where they all get on our supercomputer and they just fill it. And nobody else can get their work done because the ag is they are trying to take advantage of that very short amount of time before the window closes. And then for months you don't see them. And then they come back again for a month. And no one else can get their work done again. So when it comes to perhaps genomics, that is the pattern. To me, that seems pretty real time. If it comes to weather, I don't know, that seems pretty real time too, because if you only have a few weeks to plant or harvest, it really matters for you to know what kind of weather you're going to have tomorrow. And how to react to it, and maybe you need to move your machinery around, things like that. But if we're talking about computing, supply chain optimizations, well, yes, I would have to agree with you on that.
Yeah, no, I'm actually a hardware architect, and so for me, real time is measured in microseconds.
Okay, so
So
you
more,
answered your
if
own
not
question.
microseconds, seconds, right? So more continuous response to the data that you are sensing right now, right? That's my question.
I can give you a couple of other examples. One is agricultural robotics is a really fast-growing field. And when you have robots in the field, now you're starting to see, for example, you want robots that need to be able to detect something that they're trying to take images of, and based on the images, decide how to point the camera, where to place the camera, or maybe if they're manipulating plants or animals or something else, then you have to have very tight feedback control loops to be able to control what they're doing. A second example is the one that David mentioned, which is sensing nitrogen in the soil, but then immediately feeding it back to a planter or whatever is in the back of the machine that's dispensing fertilizer into the rows. And that is probably more than microseconds, but it's certainly not more than seconds. It's probably on the sub-second range. Yeah. So those are examples where technology needs to move further, but for sure, 5 to 10 years from now, these are going to become more common. And you're going to see many more examples like this. Yeah.
So if I may just ask a second aspect related to the systems, how much of this is or are there applications that are more sort of collaborative, where distributed computing technologies can be brought to bear? And okay, I'll stop there.
I want to pose that question to Ranveer and Naoki maybe, because they're both distributed computing people who know a lot about agriculture. Are there applications of distributed computing in this area?
So some of the scenarios, for example, we have an edge-based system.
Can you pass him a microphone? Thank you.
So I'll be covering some of that in my talk tomorrow, but we have an edge-based system which we need to be reliable, so all the reliability issues come up. In performance issues come up as well, where it could be a weak PC where you might be running multiple camera streams could be connected to it, multiple ML models could be running in every stream. And you might not, or you might have one GPU and maybe a few cores. So how do you get that up and running? So performance, reliability, all those issues come in. In fact, some of the things we're thinking of is if you have multiple of these cores distributed, how do you use all of them for a particular task? Some of the work that Bikram's doing on compilers would be, I got very excited by that. Right now we are thinking of using Kubernetes as the orchestration framework, but having compiler support to that would be great. So I think a lot of these issues come up. In fact, it's the distributed systems course at Cornell that Ken Berman is teaching on top of the farm-based system. He's using that as an example of the stretch of any of these problems that we talk about, right? This is disconnected. You have very weak connectivity even if you have it. Then you have all these real-time requirements. So how do you get it? How do you design a system for that? I think it's a hard problem. We've taken a first stab at it at Microsoft, but I think there are a lot of open problems in that space to be solved. Yeah.
Thank you.
And if I can give a quick plug to Ranveer's talk tomorrow, he's going to be talking about the farm-beat system, which is being productized and has some really interesting capabilities for IoT in agriculture.
So my question, I guess, is less about what improvements in technology we can make, but more so about how we can incorporate existing technology. So I have more experience on the swine side, but kind of as Chris was saying in his talk, a lot of these things that we've done in crop sciences, the livestock industry is a lot further behind, at least on the pig side. These much larger integrating companies are more willing to adopt technology, but when I look at some of the academic work coming out with integrating sensors and imaging, and then talk to pork producers, I mean, their problems are on such a smaller scale. They don't, they're like, imaging what? I don't know what you're talking about. How can this help? So I'm curious, and Lav asked about how to incorporate flavor and things. So on the white paper, I noticed we have a section here on extension. So I'm sort of curious how perhaps we could bring in producers or stakeholders in these industries to get a better idea of, is there a market for these higher quality meat products or other different types of flavored products?
Chocolate flavored cow.
I'm good.
Adam or Matt or Andrew, do you want to take that question?
It's the true impossible burger. I couldn't resist.
The extension 3.0 model right now has a digital first intent. And I think one of the challenges for it is going to be making these kinds of connections with producers. So it's not just information flowing from us, but there are feedbacks. What I would love to see is decision support tools that supply granular recommendations to producers, both livestock and crop producers, but that the producers who receive the recommendation actually provide feedback on that recommendation and what they're experiencing so that the underlying model and the prior that's informing that model gets shifted and the model gets better over time. So learning systems, decision support tools that get better over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that this is a problem that isn't specific only to small meat producers, but also to a lot of small farmers, horticultural suppliers, almost everything in the third world. So you get to the point where the stuff we're talking about is only applicable to these very large concerns. And I think that's something we have to avoid, from the people side of things, is to ensure that our thoughts about what technology we are developing don't serve only the loudest voices of the biggest companies.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question over here on the
Question
side.
from Steve.
Okay. I guess my question might seem a lot more basic, but I think it's a problem a lot of us are up against. One of the things we're involved in is trying to predict crop idiotypes for different environments. So how, for example, to take a simple example is, you take from Andrew's imaging a canopy of sorghum, and then you say, well, what is the optimum leaf area, leaf color, distribution through the canopy to, if you like, maximize resource use efficiency? So, for example, water. And we've done one with sorghum where we predicted a certain change would give us an increase in water use efficiency. And from the trials we conducted last year, it appears to be working. But, it's a real computational challenge because you've got so many permutations there that it takes a very long time to run this, and that's limiting it. We're trying to now tie in canopy architecture with root architecture. And so you're now dealing with billions and trillions of possible permutations in your optimization. And, although this may seem quite basic, I'd hope with an ACES NCSA link, we might be able to do something because we're amateurs at coding. NCSA clearly isn't an amateur. For example, do we see through this that we could do things like code optimization that would then allow us to explore many more options in trying to identify idiotypes and move that forward? Mm-hmm. For example, you can also combine this in with management. We did a project for Brazilian sugarcane growers where we used this type of modeling to predict the impact of different spacings that they were considering using. But again, computational power is really limiting there. But I'm sure by linking up with NCSA, we could make this a lot more efficient and maybe increase, the number of cases we can deal with.
And on that point, there's actually quite a bit of research and also quite a bit of technology in the computing world today, looking at how to solve very, very large combinatorial optimization problems that are well beyond trillions in terms of the size of the search spaces. But so trying to optimize in a search space of that size, it's beyond just better coding. There's really hard algorithmic challenges, and there's a lot of research on making those be tractable. So that might be one area where new algorithms might already exist or might be developed that could be applicable to this kind of problem. So we can talk more about that.
Vikram, can I just say one thing? That comment made me think that in the conversations we've had about the sorts of things the center does, there is a very strong educational component.
Yes.
And we've talked about one of the challenges we face is trying to find activities to focus on that are really interesting research problems on the ag side, but also really interesting research problems on the compute or engineering side. And that's something we clearly need to focus on. But when we consider the educational opportunities, there are also opportunities for undergraduates or graduate students to potentially get experience and learn some of these tools at a slightly lower level in a way that would still have a lot of value for those of us on the biology or the ag side. And we haven't really brought that up, but there's very, very much interest in that, correct?
You're right. So there are joint degree programs that we're talking about doing as part of the center. It's not been a topic of discussion so far in this discussion, but you're absolutely right. I think that's something that we are going to try and emphasize and could be really useful. So I see Mohammed had.
Yeah. So I actually have a follow-up question on the previous question. So I'm in optimization, and what I'm really interested in is crop improvement. So my question is actually, I'm trying to understand what the challenge is. Is the challenge in actually identifying genotype to phenotype? So are we trying to do GWAS here? So do we need better phenotyping? Do we need more observations? Or should we actually be thinking about how to develop algorithms that will tell us, how should we combine the desired alleles into one line that we can basically grow? So, because that's actually, that's a hard problem. There's many permutations, many possible ways of doing this. So I'm trying to figure out, where's the bottleneck? Or should we actually try to think about a way of doing this simultaneously? So maybe you want to identify genotypic traits that are actually actionable, that we can actually easily accumulate into one single line. So
I would have said both. So your simultaneous option seems a good one to me, but I don't know whether anyone else has an opinion.
We want it all.
Yeah, I think the issue here is there's compute limitations in many areas, although actually I think GWAS has received rather a lot of attention, and the genotype to phenotype thing, there's one or two. I know Luda works on epistasis, which is one of the areas that's still very challenging. But I think, as Steve Long mentioned, a lot of these models that incorporate things like metabolites and enzymes in addition to genes and sequences become very, very limited combinatorially very quickly.
So to piggyback on the previous two comments and to also be a little bit selfish and, talk about the kind of research that I like doing. In terms of technology, I think a really good technology that perhaps can be an outcome of the center is computationally efficient software that NCSA can help develop that can be readily available to the research community. And I think that can also liberate methodological development because, people can think about how the methodologies work instead of having the burden of having to debug code.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I think we had Ranveer next and then David up there.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about what do you think what's the center going to do for smallholder farmers? Is that in the charter for outside of the U.S., where the food problem is going to be most severe outside of the U.S.? Farming is still one of the biggest employers outside of the U.S. And you have such a good ag school, and tech is important. So is that in the charter of the center as well?
So I'll let the panel take the question, but the short answer is absolutely, definitely yes.
Yes, and we've got a proposal we're working on. I don't know if, Lav, you want to talk about any outlines of that, but very relevant to improving food security for smallholders in developing regions that is built on some of these technologies. So I think, there are lots of dimensions of the food insecurity problem. We've already identified a few very concrete ones that we're working on, but yes.
So does UIUC have a presence outside, like extension centers outside of the U.S.? Or do you have
not. We work with CGIAR partners, so CIMMYT, IRRI, CIAT.
Okay.
I'm actually really glad that this was brought up, because I thought that outside the US, in still developing economies, I bet it is still relevant to do the relentless optimization of their current system. And the problem of chocolate cows is less of importance. So we can still make a great impact by applying the optimizations that we already consider well in place for us, but to them, they are of high relevance.
Yeah, and the challenges are very different too in those geographies. Like some of them, how do you reach out to the farmers? We did some of them. I'll cover some of that in my talk tomorrow. But the problems, they are very different from some of the problems we face here. And because you work with CIMMYT and so on, you must have already faced some of those. But,
and I think that's an area where the people component that Matt is representing is really important. The socioeconomic conditions on the ground really change where you can have the greatest benefits.
Yeah, and just one additional point to that is, one of the things we realize is that the farming industry, it has, in every geography, it's different, because the government in every country plays such an important role with respect to regulations, with respect to subsidies. And that affects the way we think of this industry as well when we go out to different geographies. So that social aspect, the government, the policy aspect of agriculture in a world, like in a global aspect, is important as well. And it would be great to have the center focus on that too.
So I think one of the challenges that is faced across many different developing areas is creating clear incentives for reinvestment, economic reinvestment in agriculture, so that there's so much out-migration of labor, and it creates a negative feedback loop where people leave, there's not enough food, so they're more reliant upon these external sources of income. So I believe that we can develop interventions that help reverse that cycle.
I just wanted to add as well, from the people point of view, I think one of the keys to the development of agriculture to the level it's got to in this country and other developed countries to sometimes a smaller extent is the degree of trust that farmers have in the information they get from land-grant universities in particular. So there are trusted, objective sources of information about what are the best varieties, what are the best management practices. And I think one of the issues in the international scope is that we need to develop the same level of trust, and we have to develop that level of trust in the digital domain. And that doesn't yet exist, but it's something that I think we're prioritizing as part of the people theme.
So we have time for one more question, and David.
Yes, what's going to be done? One problem is, if we're working with computer sciences, if we're working with, the people on the north side with engineering, if we're working with NCSA, none of those people really want to develop software. None of those people really they want to do high-end research. And yet, if we're going to develop things that farmers and others can use, there's going to have to be money somewhere and somebody who knows how to develop software. So who's going to do that sort of less glamorous work? And is there going to be some money somewhere for that to be done?
I think let me take that question. So I think that is a really, really unclear question. I think that there are research programs or funding programs that will support developer time, they will support technical IT people and so on. And those kinds of sources of funding are the ones that we're going to have to use to build up a staff infrastructure that enables this kind of work. And that's something that I think that we're just going to have to work on as part of the center. So
Can you see?
my personal view here is that the center is not just about research, even though the research is a critical part of this and really the main driver. But I think that providing this kind of capability can make the research also more effective, but it can make your problems also easier. Go ahead. You had a response?
No, just I don't know if you would make that be an internal thing or an external thing, but it's fine. You can figure that out.
Yeah.
So I'd like to speak to that a little bit too. I mean, so the problem here is that software is necessary in order to realize all of the theoretical advances that people make, but it's extremely expensive to develop hardened, productionized software. And I know Luda has experience of this through, the Mayo Clinic collaboration, where NCSA has done that kind of thing.
Takes more time to harden the code than to develop the damn thing.
Yeah, and it ends up being very expensive because you need not only professional programmers rather than students, but you need multiple people with different domain expertise, and you need version control and somebody to manage that and all kinds of other things. So. It's difficult to do in an academic context unless you have a large, stable funding source, as is the case with Mayo. It may be possible through corporate collaborations to develop that kind of resource. And another possibility is that we actually take the innovations from the center and we try to spin those out in startup companies that will develop the software.
I also wonder if this is a space where extension might actually be a good partner, for translation of discoveries, and maybe, it gets quite a large chunk every year in Smith Lever funds, and maybe with their digital first platform, they decide that they want to invest in developers.
Mm-hmm. I think these are things we should definitely explore because this is really important for the success of the center. Okay, so with that, I would like to close. Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you very much to the audience for all of your input. And I hope that we can continue the conversation because I really want to encourage all of you to give us your input, your feedback on the 4 themes, on the white paper, any thoughts that you might have on either directions we've missed or directions you'd like to see us emphasize, or collaboration opportunities that you think you might be interested in exploring. And in fact, the next session is going to be about seed funding for encouraging these kinds of collaborations. So before I introduce Amanda, let me first give a big round of applause to the panel. Thank you very much.